dos, uno, cero.
Our first Wealth Talk in 2022, an exclusive talk to provide our Santander private banking clients with expert opinion on issues that, in one way or another, will impact global economy and markets. Let me start with logistics. The talk will be in English, but you can listen in Spanish by pressing the red ES button in the upper right corner of your screen. La charla es en inglés, pero pueden seguirla en español usando el botón ES en la parte superior derecha de su pantalla. To ask a guest a question, simply use the question comment option located at the top of your screen. Today, our Global Head of Wealth Management and Insurance, Victor Macarran, will be interviewing Megan Greene and Matthew Goodwin, well-known experts in economy and geopolitics, who will share their insights on today's hot topics. Back to you, Victor.
Thank you, Christina. And hello, everyone, and welcome back to our Wealth Talks. It's been a while, but here we are. So as Christina said, Wealth Talks are our private banking series of exclusive talks created to bring you the thoughts of renowned experts on today's hot topics. Well, for today, under the title Investing in a New World in Transition, last December we published our market outlook for 2022. The report describes the main pillars of our thinking and our base case scenario for the year from an economic and geopolitical point of view, and sets out the macro and market transitions that might impact markets with episodes of volatility. Actually, for those of you who follow the markets or who suffer the markets, January saw plenty of activity in this sense. So we thought it was very much worth updating the analysis that we did back in the end of 2021 to take account of the recent big events around the world and what's happening with regards to these transitions. So for that, it's not going to be me. We are going to be joined today by two very well-known experts whose opinion we value a lot and that have been with us a number of times in the past. So we actually thought, why looking for new people when we have the best already? So we have today Megan Greene, who joins us for the second time, I guess, and she's a senior fellow at Harvard Kennedy School and global chief of economics at Kroll. She writes a regular column on global macroeconomics for the Financial Times that I'm sure you've read many times. So welcome, Megan. We are delighted to have you with us one more time.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Excellent. And second, but not least, of course, we have Matthew Goodwin, who is a professor of politics at Rutherford College, expert in geopolitics and best-selling author, has worked with us on many occasions, as you have seen in our talks as well. So it's great to see you again, Matthew.
Thanks for having me, Victor.
A pleasure. Okay, so let's get on with it. And let me start the discussion with some sort of obvious question, and that probably you are expecting, but for which I guess the answer mutates and changes as time passes and the pandemic evolves. I mean, a world with zero COVID seems to be an unlikely scenario due to these mutations and incomplete vaccinations, etc. But on the other hand, the risk of a healthcare crisis has diminished significantly over the past months. So it looks like COVID is transitioning from a pandemic to something endemic, let me put it that way. But even if ultimately it becomes something like the flu, I think it will have some long-term effects. No? So let me start with the economic side with Megan. So how do you see the long-term effects that COVID will have in the global economy, the policies, labor force, et cetera, et cetera?
Sure. So I think there are a few long-term effects from the pandemic, even once it's become endemic. One is the role of government in our lives. So I think we've come to accept a much more interventionist role for governments. Stimulus programs were more successful than any of us had expected or could have hoped. Also, I think it feeds through into things like industrial policy, which is something 10 years ago we never would have accepted on a bipartisan basis in the United States in particular, for example. But now everyone can get behind the notion of government supporting sectors, particular technologies. So industrial policy, I think, is here to stay. There's another legacy from the pandemic, which will be higher debt, both across the developed world, but also in particular amongst emerging markets, which already had elevated levels of debt. Now they're even higher. And so we're going to have to figure out how to whittle that debt down. And it's not clear what the path is, particularly for emerging markets, and particularly as central banks, most notably the Fed, has turned more hawkish and is going to withdraw accommodation this year. That should make sovereign debt more difficult to service for a lot of emerging markets. We could end up with another emerging market debt crisis. Maybe not a story for this year, as rates will probably not get up sufficiently high, but over the course of the next few years, if those end up, in cascading defaults, we could end up with a lost decade. So that's not my base case scenario, but I'm certainly worried about an emerging market sovereign debt crisis that could be kicked off the back of this pandemic. And then in terms of labor force participation, this is mostly a scenario for the US, but the labor force participation rate hasn't rebounded from where it was before the pandemic. It's about 1 percentage point lower. That's lesser an issue in the UK. The labor force participation rate is a little bit lower than where it was pre-pandemic, but not as big as in the US. And in the Eurozone, it's actually completely recovered. So there is a question about labor market scarring, where all those workers went and whether they're coming back or not. I tend to think that actually a lot of these workers are out because of COVID. They're sick with COVID. They're afraid of being sick because of COVID. Their kids are sick because of COVID, or their kids' schools have been closed because of COVID. I think that's still affecting the labor force participation rate in the US. And also financial cushions were built up. And so a number of workers have just stayed out of the labor force because they didn't have to go back in for a paycheck. They didn't have to take those low wage, low hour services jobs that hardly allowed them to make ends meet before the pandemic. But as they burn through their cushion, and the data suggests that should happen in the first quarter of this year, they're going to have to jump back in and capitulate for a paycheck. And so that should address some of the labor force participation rate. But this is a huge question. We've never been through this before. And so this could be a legacy of the pandemic, that there just has been labor market scarring. And so therefore the labor force participation rate is much smaller going forward, which makes the labor market a lot tighter, which means that central banks are going to have to be much more aggressive in terms of tightening going forward.
And sorry, just a follow-up question there on the debt, on the potential debt crisis for emerging markets. What would be the impact in not in the emerging markets on the other side of the world?
The impact of an emerging market debt crisis, or the impact of higher debt?
In general, higher debt, I would say, yeah.
Yeah, generally, emerging market debt crises tend to have little actual blowback in terms of the macro picture for developed economies. I actually think in Europe, you've seen Spanish, Italian, and Greek yields back up in the past week because the ECB became much more hawkish than it was. In my view, the ECB is on its way to making a huge mistake, to basically repeating the policy mistakes that it made in 2008 when it hiked rates into higher energy costs, which the ECB can do absolutely nothing about. And killed off the nascent recovery then. I think it risks doing the same this time around, and that could revive fragmentation issues in the Eurozone in particular. I don't think we'll end up seeing the kind of Euro crisis that we had before, just because there are programs in place to address fragmentation, mainly the OMT program, which has never been used, but still exists as kind of a vague idea. But at least it is there. But I do think that we could see an increase in yields in the periphery in the Eurozone.
Okay. Thank you, Megan. Very, very useful. And Matthew, what about the long-term impacts of the pandemic on politics, and specifically on populism, public sector interventionism? How do you see that?
Yeah, well, I think if you look at the political impact of the pandemic where we are at the moment, one of the things that comes out clearly from the research on how past pandemics have impacted on geopolitics is that essentially it's still a little bit too early to make a call. For this discussion, Victor, I was reviewing one of the largest studies that's been done today on the impact of pandemics. and it examined 133 countries between 2001 and 2018, and found that political unrest tends to peak 2 years after a typical epidemic. So if that's true, then as we go through 22, 23, we're likely to experience some of those political effects. I think we can already see some of them beginning to appear. If you look at the US and the UK, we've seen two leaders who led their countries through the pandemic struggling to retain support. Joe Biden's approval ratings as of this morning are now lower than George Bush's, Barack Obama's, and Donald Trump's at the same point in their presidencies. In fact, Joe Biden's approvals are about 40%, which suggests that we're likely to see a changing of political power in the US over the next few years. Boris Johnson's ratings, of course, have also crashed, partly because he's failed to show that he is a competent leader who is playing by the rules. And by the way, Victor, one of the reasons that matters is because if you were to transfer the current numbers in the UK into a forecast model, you'd be looking at Labour as the largest party, perhaps with support from the Scottish National Party, which would raise the prospect of a second referendum in Scotland. But if you look globally, The Economist recently noted that civil unrest around the globe since the pandemic began has risen by around 10%, despite those extensive lockdowns. So we've seen, for example, significant disruption in the Netherlands, South Africa, Belarus, Thailand, and we can also see, I think, signs of some growing unrest in places like Kenya, India, Brazil. Megan mentioned some potential economic issues. I think Brazil is one to watch. And I think it's also worth remembering that some of these protest movements were already on the rise before the pandemic hit. The Institute for Economics and Peace, which is a think tank in Sydney, recently noted that protest movements globally, the number of those protest movements had more than doubled between 2011 and 2019. And I would also point out that for many people who are tuning into this discussion, they will know from their own countries that there's not really much evidence yet that populism is being in decline during this pandemic. Donald Trump seems fairly well consolidated in the Republican Party. Portugal has seen the breakthrough of Chega or enough. The polling in Italy is quite volatile, and in France, the combined left-wing vote is on 25%, while the combined vote for Marine Le Pen and Eric Zemmour is around 30 to 35%. So I think, in broad terms, I don't think we've seen fundamental changes. We're likely to see, I think, some continuing volatility, some good reasons to see that. And I think much of that, lastly, Victor, is linked to the rising economic hardship, which we're now beginning to see come through, inflation, a new cost of living crisis, and I'm sure we're going to discuss that in future questions. But I think fundamentally, the reactions are beginning to come through politically, but they will not reach their maturity for 1 or 2 years yet.
Yeah. So does it mean that if we are lucky enough to get past through 2022, we are freed of this risk?
Well, of course, that study I mentioned, remember, is based on much smaller pandemics.
Yeah.
Things like Ebola, for example.
Yeah.
What we've been dealing with is obviously a global pandemic. So we are in uncharted territory. Basically.
Territories, yeah. No, and I guess it makes some sense because, all the effects take some time to blend in. So it makes sense that it doesn't happen during or right after, but it takes some time anyway. Hopefully not. Okay, so let me turn to the second block of transitions, if I may. So the second area that we wanted to touch upon is one that is undergoing a major transition too, which is energy. The sector is now experiencing many shocks at the same time. The transition to clean energies, which is limiting investment flows into traditional or fossil fuels and boosting demand for renewables, supply disruptions in many value chains, and lately the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, which has become another big source of volatility in many aspects, but also in energy markets. So let me start with Matthew. So what do you think is what can we expect from governments in the reaction to the general energy changes, transition, and more specifically, what would you think would be the consequences for Europe on if these things between Russia and Ukraine come to worst?
Well, let me start with the second question and work backwards. Okay. The blunt reality is anybody who has looked at the energy markets knows is that Europe remains highly dependent upon gas from Russia. So in theory, any invasion or proxy invasion is likely to put enormous pressure on supplies, put enormous pressure on energy systems, and most likely send prices even higher than they are at the moment. To put that in numerical terms, Russia is still the EU's top supplier. It accounts for about 43% of imported gas, followed by Norway and Algeria. It's the biggest net importers of gas from Russia. Are Germany, Italy, France, Spain, Belgium, and Britain. Even though Britain imports about less than 3% of its gas supplies from Russia, it's still importing around 32 billion cubic meters of natural gas each year. So it could have profound consequences, which is why I think last week the EU Energy Commissioner Kadri Simpson tried to essentially reassure Europe's energy markets and ministers by outlining what the strategy and the reaction to that invasion or potential invasion would be. So firstly, we're going to see a much stronger geopolitical push to diversify gas imports, to reduce Europe's reliance on Russia. EU ministers have been calling to increase imports from the United States, from Qatar. There is secondly going to be a much stronger push to move to cleaner energy sources, renewables and so forth. In the UK, we're already here talking about increasing the amount of attention on energy efficiency measures, retrofitting homes, insulating homes better. There's a massive cost of living crisis fixer coming down the track here in the UK. By the way, we've got estimates that households are going to be paying about £700–800 extra every year because of the energy crisis, which has led Chancellor Rishi Sunak to make changes to local municipal tax, whereby households will be able to have some money given back to them, which goes to show how serious politically actually the energy crisis is being taken. So any escalation in Ukraine, any prolonged crisis is certainly going to impact on gas prices in the short term and is going to contribute to the overall volatility of the markets over the long term. And also, just as an aside, it's not just going to be gas. One of the things I think the public discussion is missing out, it's that several other commodities are also going to increase significantly: oil, wheat, metals, which would also send commodity prices upwards. And geopolitically, lastly, before handing over to Megan, we have to also remember the actors who are watching this crisis. If Putin decides to move on Ukraine, China will be watching with regard to Taiwan. Iran and Syria will be watching. And Putin will probably be encouraged to probe for further holes in the NATO alliance. So I think ultimately it's a potential flashpoint that could have absolutely huge consequences, which the ordinary consumer and the citizen is going to feel almost immediately.
Right. Thank you, Matthew. And Megan, you recently published an article in the FT analyzing how sanctions are impacting Russia. Do you think these work in the end? I mean, do you think the West is really capable of changing Putin's mind or affecting his behavior with this?
Yeah, so it depends very much on how you define success for sanctions. If success is measured by changed behavior, the history of sanctions is appalling. They're not very effective at actually changing behavior. They can, however, impose pain on an economy. Although that being said, there is a study that shows that the sanctions that we imposed on Russia in 2014 had a smaller impact on the Russian economy than lower oil prices in 2015, 2016. So we didn't go with sort of a maximum pain campaign in 2014. That being said, we've promised to this time around. And so Russia's already a heavily sanctioned economy. I have to believe that imposing more sanctions on Russia probably won't change behavior or minds among leadership. So I don't think that's a metric of success. But I do think we could impose a lot of pain on the Russian economy this time around. There's talk of imposing sanctions on Putin himself, not to mention a number of his cadres. There's also talk of kicking Russia out of SWIFT, which I actually don't think we'll end up doing. Mostly because there are ways to get around SWIFT, mainly to just jump on other payment systems or communication systems around.
But you connect from that, yeah.
Yeah, and China has developed one, by the way, so Russia can just go ahead and use China. It sort of accelerates the move away from the financial plumbing that the West has set up through SWIFT. And we don't really want to accelerate a move away from that because we can wield some power with SWIFT. So I don't think we'll use that tool. That would be the most painful. That being said, I think sanctions could be difficult, though, as Matt has said, it'll be difficult for Europe. Wheat prices will go up around the world as well. So it's not that the pain will be one way, but of course, Russia will suffer a lot more than most Western economies off the back of sanctions. I just don't think it will influence behavior.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, in any case, geopolitics and energy have driven major dynamics through history. And based on what both of you just said, I think we're going to see a lot of headlines in this area this year. So we'll keep a close eye on it. Thank you. But so let me shift gears again. And I want to leave some space also for the questions from the audience, because we have more than 500 people now joining us. So thank you, everyone, for being with us this afternoon or this morning, if you're on the other side of the world. So let me shift gears to deglobalization. So the famous bottlenecks and their impact in their global growth. No, as a result of all these disruptions in the global value chains, companies are experiencing many problems, no, when fulfilling investments and consumer demand. So, Megan, what is your take on this topic, on globalization and the bottlenecks? Will these disruptions that are affecting all the value chains diminish during this year? Will continue? Will they grow? What are your views on this? Because this is very much in everyone's mind for many reasons. Huh?
Yeah, so I'll start off by saying that at the beginning of this pandemic, we economists, myself included, put out a narrative that said, well, we can't get PPE, for example. We've been too reliant on global supply chains. We're all going to onshore and nearshore, and we're going to have deglobalization. No one really went and checked to see whether that actually happened. So I did for a recent Financial Times column and discovered unfortunately, there's no metric of globalization, but you can look at a lot of proxies. You can look at world trade flows, you can look at FDI flows, you can look at hot money, you can look at sticky money. If you look at all of those metrics, there is actually no evidence that we've seen significant shifts away from global supply chains towards onshoring and nearshoring. So we may have slower globalization than we had before. And it's not to say we'll never have deglobalization, but we certainly haven't had it yet. A lot of industries, semiconductors, for example, you can't just snap your fingers and repattern your supply chains. It takes 4 years to build a semiconductor factory in Arizona, for example, before it will even be operational. So I'll start off with that point. And I don't think we're in deglobalization. That being said, there have been all kinds of supply chain disruptions in our global supply chains. And I think that will last for part of this year, though we're already seeing signs that they are abating. So if you look at this purchasing manager surveys that companies fill out in the US, they're reporting shorter order backlogs, shorter delivery times. And so that's an indication that maybe supply chain disruptions are abating. The New York Fed has come up with its own global supply chain tightness index. And over the past 2 months, it shows that it has plateaued. So, you shouldn't extrapolate too much from 2 months data, but that suggests that maybe we're seeing some easing of these issues. Maersk came out, the big shipping company, the Danish shipping company, came out this morning and said that their guidance is that in the second half of this year, a lot of these supply chain issues should have been ironed out. There's one huge risk to a forecast that suggests that these issues should abate, and that's China and China's zero COVID policy. We've already seen factory closures and lockdowns at the beginning of this year as a result of the Omicron variant. It's unclear how long that will last, given the zero COVID policy, given very few Chinese actually have immunity to it because of that policy. And the Sinovac vaccine has shown very low efficacy towards the Omicron variant. And so if Chinese factories continue to shut down, we continue to see lockdowns over the course of this year, that will exacerbate supply chain disruptions. If the Omicron variant is shorter lived in China, as it has been elsewhere, I think we'll see supply chain disruptions abate in the second half of this year. And in the beginning of next year, I think we can look towards what will be something like normality in terms of our supply chains. I also think, part of the supply chain issue is that we've bought a lot of stuff, which we haven't done in decades. There's been a huge trend towards buying goods rather than services. As the Omicron variant wanes and this becomes endemic, I think we'll go back to buying more services. And so that should also ease up the demand side of these supply chain disruptions as well.
All right. So, I mean, it's great to hear that. I mean, you sound relatively optimistic, well, except for the China thing, but it's great because I heard way more gloomy stories about this. So that's great to hear. So let me turn to the specific case of the UK, because Matthew, in the UK, I mean, it's like now every time you want to get something, you can choose one of the two excuses. You can say it's the global value chain disruption, or you can say it's Brexit. So what are your views on these two overlapping factors? How are they interacting? Are they kind of making the problem worse, or is it just the global value chain and Brexit is not really doing much? What are your views there?
Yeah, so I think there's certainly an ongoing debate, Victor, about how the pandemic has essentially removed what was a perfect natural experiment to explore what impact leaving the European Union would have on trade and economic links between the UK and the European Union. It's become a much more difficult, complicated, convoluted process of disentangling which is having the biggest impact. Is it Brexit? Is it the pandemic? Or is it pre-existing supply chain problems? I think my personal view, and having spent really the last couple of weeks just reviewing much of the evidence on it, is that I don't think there's any doubt whatsoever that Brexit has exacerbated some of the trade disruptions that were already there or were caused partly by the pandemic and this big boost of demand. And that's been especially visible in key sectors of the economy, the haulage industry being perhaps one of them. And it's been exacerbated by our new immigration policy. Brexit, of course, was followed by the arrival of a skill-based immigration policy, which has simply made it harder for EU nationals, especially low, medium skilled workers, to come into the UK, and many have left as a consequence. So we've seen specific sectors like food manufacturing have had particular problems. We've seen a lot of EU nationals who have gone home during the pandemic. And we've also, something that's talked about a little bit less actually, is a lot of training and recruitment programs within these industries were then disrupted by COVID lockdowns. So if you think about the fact that we've been short of around 60,000 lorry drivers in the UK, according to the Institute for Government, many of the training and recruitment programs within those sectors were then disrupted by the lockdowns. And look, Brexit wasn't the only reason for that. That's been an industry that has been suffering from low wages, an aging workforce, poor working conditions. And the government's moved to try and fill that hole by looking at things like short-term visas for migrant workers, but we've not had sufficient take up of those. What is clear, if you look at the data on trade, is that the trading relationship with the European Union has changed in important ways. Imports from the European Union are still below where they were before the pandemic, while today over half of all of the UK's trade, about 52%, is with countries outside of the European Union. Exports to the European Union have basically been flatlining between 2018 and 2021. Now, look, I mean, if we look at both sides of this argument, if you're a Brexiteer, you would say, well, look, that's basically what Brexit was about, right? That they wanted to essentially cultivate all of these stronger links with non-European countries. If, on the other hand, you're a Remainer or an anti-Brexiteer, you say, well, that's a big hit to our closest and a very strong trading partner to take. Only this week, the Office for National Statistics has shown that total goods traded between the UK and the EU was 25% less in quarter one of 2021 and 15% less in quarter two compared to 2018. And those falls were much greater than the equivalent declines in UK trade with the rest of the world. And just lastly, Victor, the Office for Budget Responsibility in its most recent forecast, released just before Christmas, has shown that total UK imports and exports will be 15% lower than they would have been had the UK stayed in the European Union, which is why we then have this exacerbated problem with productivity. So I think overall, there's no doubt that as the UK has gone out of the transition period at the end of 2020 and has gone into essentially real Brexit, not transition Brexit, we have seen trade significantly suppressed, both by COVID-19 and global pressures, but also by Brexit. And thankfully, as a political scientist, I don't need to spend the next 10 years trying to disentangle which of those effects are because of Brexit and which are because of COVID, though I suspect Megan, in a FT piece 10 years from now, may have the data to figure out which of those was more costly.
Well, I mean, I guess you can almost make it up because nobody's going to be able to measure it. but anyway, no, thank you. That's very useful. Okay. Let me move to the final block that we had foreseen here, which is the big and growing elephant in the room, which is inflation and monetary policy transition, therefore. So this is probably the most important transition for financial markets of everything that we've talked about, which is the reduction in policy support, and particularly in supporting monetary policy. Now, the surge of inflation readings across the globe, magnified by these trade disruptions that we have said, and the crisis, the energy crisis, has forced central banks to begin tightening monetary policy, and this is starting to have some impacts. We are seeing even the effects in the markets. Some say even that the fall in crypto, the later falling in the crypto valuation, has something to do with the decrease of monetary support. So let me start with Megan. And you talked a little bit about this before, but how would you grade the ECB and the Fed in terms of how they've managed this transition so far? And you were hinting something about the future also before.
Yeah, so I'll start with the Fed and then move on to the ECB because okay. I think the policy responses are and should be different because the causes of inflation are very different. So in the U.S., it's partly demand-driven with pent-up demand being released, but also us buying a lot of stuff, a lot of goods rather than services. That's a piece of the story. I actually think the bigger piece of the inflation story in the U.S. is the supply side, and that's both the supply chain disruptions that we've discussed, but also the supply of labor, which is unique to the U.S. is a problem, really, because it's lower than it was before, suggesting actually the labor force could be tight and wage growth could really take off in that environment. But if workers are actually going to jump back in and the labor force participation rate might recover, then there's some slack in the labor market and the Fed doesn't need to be so aggressive. Now, that being said, the Fed has turned very hawkish over the past couple of months, really starting in November, December of last year. Economists seem to be trying to out-hawk one another lately with how many rate hikes they can call for the Fed to do this year. I think the biggest one is the Bank of America expects 7 rate hikes by the Fed this year.
Wow.
I think while right now the Fed is very focused on inflation, the growth outlook in the U.S. looks pretty weak for this year. The Atlanta Fed Nowcast shows growth. Remember, it starts very high at the beginning of a quarter. As data comes in, it almost always gets lower. It's at 0.1% for the first quarter of this year. That's incredibly low and, should in theory get lower from there, depending on how the data comes in. We're facing a huge fiscal drag in the US. With rates going up, the investment environment won't be as constructive as it was last year. Consumers are running out of their financial cushion. The external demand picture looks pretty weak, particularly with China slowing down. So I think in the second half of this year, the Fed's going to be looking much more at growth and demand than it is at inflation, which I think should be on its way down by then. Now, I think the Fed will hike rates 4 times this year, even though I am a paid up member of Team Transitory on the inflation debate. And that's because that is not a huge withdrawal of accommodation. The Fed thinks that the long run neutral rate, the rate at which the economy is running at potential with full employment and inflation at 2%, that rate is 2.5%. If the Fed hikes 4 times this year, rates will be up to 1%. So that's not the Fed hitting the brakes. That's the Fed removing its foot from the accelerator a little bit. Monetary policy will still be incredibly accommodative. And I think that's appropriate. If you look at the financial bubbles that we're seeing in the US, particularly the equity markets, I think there are financial stability concerns. It makes sense for the Fed to take their gas off the accelerator a little bit. That being said, the ECB is a different story. So inflation is driven much more by energy costs in the Eurozone and food costs to a certain degree. And so the ECB has now adopted a much more hawkish tone than most economists have expected, and are now, expecting to end QE faster and also start hiking this year where that wasn't previously expected. None of that will help do anything about energy costs. So that's really what's underpinning inflation in the Eurozone. And inflation has gotten to 5%. That's really high for the Eurozone. But it is largely energy driven. The ECB can't do anything about that. So they risk tightening monetary policy and basically putting a damper on demand as the recovery is really just getting started in the Eurozone. I think that's a mistake. I think that we're going to end up seeing a repeat of 2008 unless the ECB goes ahead and backs off of the hawkish tone that it adopted last week. And so this is why peripheral yields are rising. And I think they'll continue to as the ECB withdraws accommodation, ends its TLTROs, which were incredibly accommodative for banks, but particularly peripheral banks. I think that will be a mistake.
Yeah, that's a concern for us Europeans, and I think we have history there, given the bad hints, as you say. So hopefully somebody's listening to what you're saying. Let me flip to the interaction of this with the fiscal consideration. So what will be, Matthew, the impact of inflation and this new cost of living crisis that you were saying on politics? How does this translate into politics?
Yeah, I mean, I think, whether we're talking about something temporary or something longer term, I think the impact of inflation politically has always been one of the hot questions in political science. There's no doubt, Victor, when I look at the global surveys that we have and the polling that we have, that inflation is now a major worry for voters. The economy is now, by a long mile, the number one issue in most, if not all, advanced Western democracies. And in some respects, we're returning back to where we were really in the 2010s, when, of course, after the global financial crash and the sovereign debt crisis in Europe, we again saw the issue agenda be really dominated by issues around cost of living, around the economy, the management of the economy, and those bread and butter issues. And we know from history that that is going to impact low-income households, low-income communities much harder than it is going to impact high-income households and high-income communities. I was struck by some of the Gallup data that was released last week in the US, which found that in households in America that are relying on less than $40,000 a year, 71% of them said that inflation is already causing them some form of financial hardship. In households relying on more than $100,000 a year, only 29% said the same thing. Why does this matter politically? Because we're likely to see some form of backlash at some of the big elections that we have on the horizon. Obviously, we've got the big midterms in the United States, and typically incumbent parties tend to be blamed for sharp turns in the economy. And there's a fairly strong relationship between, for example, the president's approval ratings and economic data points like inflation. So that, again, I think gives me a bit more evidence to suggest that we're probably on the cusp of quite a sharp political change of direction. And just one key point, I think, Victor, for me is there's often an assumption that runs through these debates, which says, well, when the economy takes a turn for the worse, people tend to vote for left-wing parties because they campaign on cost of living issues and they campaign on redistribution and all those kinds of issues. Actually, that's not necessarily the case. If you look at the last 12 years and the legacy of the financial crash being, the most recent example that we have, what we saw actually in some respects was the very opposite of that. We saw a lot of conservative, a lot of right-wing populist parties doing very well. Of course, the 2010s gave us Donald Trump, Brexit, some pretty significant changes within Europe's party systems. And that, to me, I think gives us some cause for hesitation around assuming that all of this is going to see a return to the old left and right political map. But it's going to have a big impact, certainly. If listeners want one little indicator just to watch out for in the next little while, obviously, we have a number of crunch local elections coming up. But one of the key indicators I'm going to be watching in the spring is what happens in a lot of those local elections that are going to be held here in the UK in those red wall seats in Northern England, which Boris Johnson won from Labour. If you see those beginning to abandon the Conservatives and going back to the Labour Party, I think that's, again, another good indication of where we may be heading in the future. But we've also, of course, got the French presidential elections in the spring, and we've got those all-important midterms in the US to keep ourselves busy.
Right. So let me start with the questions from the audience, actually, with something that you said, because you said it doesn't necessarily mean that people are going to shift votes to the left, but what they are asking me, and you said something about this before, but does all of this mean that we have an increase in populism?
Well, I think the way that I would view this is say, look at what we already know is happening to political systems in the West over the last 20 years. So what do we know is happening? We know that, firstly, they're fragmenting. We know that a larger number of parties are doing better at elections, and we know that the older mainstream parties are struggling to kind of keep their coalitions together. So that's point one that was already happening before the pandemic. Point two is we know voters are becoming more volatile. They're less tribally loyal. They're voting for one party at one election, another party at another election. And that's, the second key point. And three, both of those really help us to explain why populists first on the left, but later on the right, have been able to break through in a lot of party systems in a much bigger way than they did in the 1980s or the 1990s. So those two things really give me some confidence. I mean, I've written about this in a number of books, that I think many of the political trends that we've seen over the last 10 years or so are not actually a flash in the pan, that implies, I think, they're going to be a permanent presence on the landscape for a long time to come. That's not necessarily saying that countries are going to go fully populist and we're going to have this sort of big onslaught against liberalism, but we are going to have more volatility in politics, which is going to make elections less predictable. And in places like Europe, it's going to make it harder to get ideologically coherent governments. So if you look at countries like Belgium, the Netherlands, Portugal, Italy, it's just going to become harder to get fairly coherent governments that are strong, that are stable, and that are going to last over a long period of time. And I suspect Megan actually is right in pointing to the way in which some of the longer term economic trends are also going to feed into that. And of course, the US is slightly different in that I think in the US, what we are probably likely to see is not just a very bad set of midterm results for the Democrats, but I think we're probably going to see a much more significant challenge to democratic norms in America, where the legitimacy of elections, whoever wins them, is going to be increasingly up for debate. That's not a great place to be for any democracy.
Yeah. Sometimes I think like political coherence has changed, and we don't understand the concept anymore. But we will see. We will see. So let me take one of the audience questions for Megan. So Megan, they asked me here, what is your view about the regulatory push towards ESG and clean energies, and whether specifically this is causing more inflation in the global economy?
Yeah, so most people wouldn't be surprised to hear me say that I think Europe is facing an energy crisis, but most people would be surprised to hear me say I think the US is too. And that is partly down to ESG. I think fossil fuels have been chronically underfunded and underinvested in for a number of years. The trend really started in 2013, 2014, but has been turbocharged by ESG. Fossil fuel stocks were some of the best performing last year, and no institutional money went into them, largely because of ESG restrictions. Now that's by design. It's an unintended consequence, but it does mean that when demand has recovered, like it has in the US, for example, for energy, but supply can't just be turned on because of chronic underinvestment, you end up with higher energy costs. And so I think there is a role for ESG to ascribe to ESG. I don't think ESG is the only reason there has been chronic underinvestment in fossil fuels, pushing energy prices up. But like I said, the trend predates the ESG movement, particularly in the US, but it certainly exacerbated it. You've seen two narratives emerge off the back of energy cost increases in Europe recently. One is that the transition to green energy has gone too fast and renewables haven't been developed to fill the gap. The second is that, of course, the transition hasn't gone fast enough because we can't rely on fossil fuels, clearly. And we're seeing that even more so now with the tensions between Russia and Ukraine. Now, which narrative is really going to prevail in Europe it remains to be seen. I think it will probably be the latter one, but we're just starting that debate in the US as we've already seen energy costs climb up. It's not controversial to suggest that oil will get to $100 a barrel this year. A number of energy analysts are actually suggesting it could get to $150 a barrel, which would be a real shock for the economy. And it hinges not just on ESG constraints in terms of investment, but also other constraints in terms of supply. Will the shale patches be turned back on? How much is left in them? In the US, we've considered them to be basically inexhaustible, but we're starting to discover that they're not. Will we strike a deal with Iran, a nuclear deal? And how quickly can we get Iranian oil online and shipped out? That's a big question. And how efficient can we make renewables? They're already much cheaper than fossil fuels, but the energy that they produce relative to the energy required to produce them is actually not as efficient as fossil fuels yet. So how quickly can we generate technological developments to improve that efficiency for renewables? Those are some big questions that will determine energy forecasts going forward. So it's really not just ESG. There are a number of other supply constraints as well playing a role.
Energy in general, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, very clear. Thank you, Megan. So I have one for Matthew here on Europe, which I know it's a topic that you love. So they say, whatever crisis come next, Europe will not have Angela Merkel to manage the difficult negotiations and trade-offs between countries. How do you see the equilibrium post-Merkel, and how the next French election could play a role in that?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. It's $1 million question for 2022 in many respects. I think, firstly, the German-France alliance has always been absolutely, central to Europe. It's been the main engine of European Union reform and strategy. And I think there's now a significant degree of uncertainty over where that relationship goes, given the changes in Germany and the election in France. Looking at the polling in France, by the way, I don't think it's particularly likely. He says famously that Emmanuel Macron will lose the election against all of the key contenders, whether the centre-right or Marine Le Pen or Eric Zemmour, who's been leading the pack in the polls recently. Macron wins under every scenario. In fact, he wins most comfortably against Marine Le Pen and is most closely challenged by the centre-right. But that's nonetheless, if he wins, he's going to want to return to the EU reform agenda as quickly as possible. I think, by the way, there's quite an interesting opportunity for Italy within this debate. I think Italy is feeling quite confident. It's got a new role on the European stage. Draghi, I think generally the consensus is he's been doing a pretty decent job. He's pretty experienced. He's got good relationships with the French. And I think more generally, there's been, I think, a sort of consensus that the European Union, barring any sort of sovereign debt crisis that Megan mentioned, is going to be getting back as quickly as possible to the key questions of reform, growth and strategy. Also, Macron's been making a big play around the border security issue during the French election, is something that he wants to personally prioritize. But yeah, I mean, it might be also worthwhile, Victor, perhaps asking Megan to reflect on some of the economics around the Eurozone as well. But that would be my broad assessment.
Yeah. Megan, any comments on Europe in general? Thank you, Matthew.
Yeah, so I mentioned that there are fragmentation risks that I think will increase if the ECB stays on a hawkish path. On the bright side, though, the Eurozone is, or the EU is getting what one Italian policymaker said to me was money from heaven, which is these next-gen EU funds, some of which come in the form of grants, some of which come in the form of loans. And so that will provide some fiscal boost for the Eurozone. A lot of it has to be earmarked for climate change. A lot of it has to be earmarked for digitalization that, if implemented well, could boost potential growth across the EU. That being said, I'm a little concerned about the "if implemented well" clause that I just added. First of all, we've seen that EU countries aren't very good at absorbing funds from Brussels in the form of cohesion and structural funds. On average, they actually manage to spend about half of what they get. Italy and Spain are particularly bad. Greece, surprisingly, is very good at it now. They've learned the hard way. And the assumption about the absorption of these funds is on an incredibly aggressive time schedule that EU countries have never shown they can manage to do before. So, it's a question of finding good local implementation, which is difficult in a lot of countries, and also good projects to spend this money on. Secondly, the money only comes in exchange for reforms, of course. And a lot of these reforms are reforms that the Commission has been pushing for a decade, and they haven't been done because they're difficult and politically unpopular. And so, Italy, for example, has about 100 reforms that it has to implement by the end of the year to get all the money. Will they manage to do that? Even with Mario Draghi as prime minister, there's an election next year. All the parties are already in campaign mode. I think it's going to be very difficult for even Draghi to get through 100 reforms by the end of the year. So there's some risk around that as well. So generally, I'm actually constructive on Europe relative to how I usually feel about Europe, but I would highlight that it's possible that they won't get this right, and that has huge implications for the future if there is another Euro crisis, because if they screw it up this time, there's no way Germany and the Netherlands and Austria are going to agree to issue debt together and mutualize it. So it's not as important for this crisis as it is for the next one, and the jury's still out on that.
Yeah, I quite agree actually with what you're saying, in particular about the use of funds. It's been quite a challenging task for some of the countries, especially for my fellow Spaniards, as you said, Italians. All right. I have a few questions actually about Ukraine that we touched upon before, but I guess they are asking the $1 million question about what do you think it's going to happen? Is it going to escalate, or is it going to get to an easier point? And this is for any of you. So who wants to take that one?
Well, sorry, after you, Megan.
Okay, I'll just say quickly that I think it will be very difficult for Putin to back down at this point. And so I do think it will escalate, and I do think that the West will have to respond. I think one of the important things to watch is how well Europe and the US managed to stick together on this one. Olaf Scholz, the German chancellor, and Joe Biden met and apparently came up with an agreement, but there's still some water between them on how they feel about Nord Stream 2, for example. So seeing what that solidarity looks like. But as Matthew already mentioned, it's no coincidence that as Russia and Ukraine tensions rose, China sent 4 jets into Taiwanese airspace. I think there is coordination there. And so I think that the West will absolutely have to respond, if not just so that China in particular will digest the information that the US and Europe won't just sit idly by.
Thank you. I would broadly agree with that, Victor. I think, as I mentioned earlier on, one of the key dynamics in all of this is whether or not NATO and Western allies can actually find the unity and countermeasures that go beyond some of the traditional sanction routes. And if they fail to meet this moment, then I think we're likely to see further incursions into looking for weak spots within that alliance. I think that's almost certain.
All right. So you have 2 minutes, but let me throw 2 kind of crystal ball questions as well that I got, and you pick them as you like. So the first one is, are there any big risks that you think markets are not pricing in at the moment? And the second is very specific. Any chances of Trump returning to the White House anytime soon?
I'll take the second one if Megan wants to take the first.
I'll take them both.
Although she may have thoughts on the second.
Yeah, I do, as someone sitting in the US.
Yeah.
I'll start off with the first one. I think risks of an imminent recession aren't priced in at all, and I think it's much more likely that we actually end up in a recession in the US and the Eurozone than that we have runaway inflation that turns into a 1970s style wage price spiral. So I think that's a risk that the markets aren't seeing. It's not my base forecast, but I think it's much more likely than the upside inflation risk that a lot of investors are looking at. In terms of Donald Trump returning to the White House, I think he'll absolutely run in 2024. I don't see any real competition on among the Republicans for the nomination. I think he will be the candidate. And I also think that the Democrats have been, stuck in fighting over the course of the past few years and might have trouble putting up a candidate to challenge him. So I unfortunately think that, there's a good chance that Donald Trump will end up back in the White House.
I think I broadly agree with that. I think if you were simply to look at the data points, Joe Biden, historically there's a very strong relationship between presidential leadership ratings and what happens at elections. And as I said, this week Biden's actually surpassed Donald Trump's rating at this point. Trump was at 42%, Biden's now at 40% approval. and obviously we know that the economic context in some respects is going to get more difficult. I don't think it's a certainty that Trump necessarily wins if he runs. I think we will see considerable mobilization among Democrats, among all of the groups who really loathe Trump. But I think the problem is the Democrats are going to have to come up with a compelling message that goes beyond Biden's message of 2020, which was essentially, I'm not Donald Trump. The Republicans have made significant gains among white non-graduate voters, some significant gains among Hispanic Latino voters, although some of those have been exaggerated by commentators. But I think it's not hard to see how actually the Republicans do mobilize quite a considerable challenge to Democrats. I'm actually less concerned about the outcome than I am about the contested legitimacy of the outcome, whoever wins. I think, if Trump wins, Democrats say, it's rigged. If Biden or Democrat person wins, Republicans obviously say the election's been stolen. I think the biggest worry for me, actually, Victor, is the speed at which democratic norms in America are being eroded. I think that's the big challenge for the Republic. I was at a conference a few weeks ago in France with American journalists, and their consensus was essentially that the primary challenge is not Trump, it's maintaining support in the legitimacy of the system.
Yeah, I would support that. The redistricting that's happening right now sort of sets the stage for legitimate election results being contested going forward. So if it doesn't happen in 2024, it could well happen in 2026 at the midterms.
All right. We will be all staying tuned for that. So, no matter what happens, I'm sure it's going to be, we are not going to be very bored over the next months. But anyway, we are over the time. So thank you very, very much, Megan and Matthew. I could continue the whole evening with this kind of ping pong between economics and politics and Europe and the US. It's fascinating. And you were quite daring in your answers in some of them. So thank you very much. It was really, really interesting. And I hope we have the opportunity to talk soon. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Victor.
Thank you. And thanks everyone for connecting. Remember, you can watch all of our wealth talks at santanderprivatebanking.com. So please join us again for another insightful conversation in a few weeks' time. Stay safe. Thank you very much.